welcome in. I think it makes a lot of sense to, revisit the advice or, whether it's advice that you provide or trends or strategy that you tend to stick with. There are always lessons to be learned following a season, right? Because you stick with a plan. Your plan differs a little bit, right, each year, but you generally keep the same mindset when it comes to building a team, because that's your bread and butter. That's what you know. As we know, things don't always work out the way that you predict or think that they will. So what I want to do today is quickly take a look at some of the trends that I stood true with and supported and backed going into the 2020 season, things that I told people to do or not to do. I want to revisit that. I want to take a look at where we got things right and maybe where we got things wrong and why did we get them wrong. I think that maybe is the more important thing to focus on. That's the way that you improve. It's easy to rest on, I got this guy, I nailed this pick, I got this pick right, or even I got this value guy right. That's great. That's all well and good. We all hit on values. Everyone does it at some point. What you have to also do is take a step back. Even if you had a good season, even if you won the championship, I promise you probably did something that you would redo if you could. So let's talk about that today. I had two strategies, trends that I kind of stuck with in 2020. And that was to invest in running back early. Newsflash. Although, regardless, even full PPR, I was a big advocate for getting running backs early because the depth of wide receiver continues. At this point in the NFL, each year, year over year, there are excellent wide receivers everywhere on pretty much every team. I would say almost every team has at least one viable fantasy receiver. Most have two, some have three. That's just the way that the offense in today's NFL works. It favors wide receiver production. So I was touting, invest early in running back, take two with your first two picks if you have to. Even if it feels like you're passing over a stud wide receiver, you'll get other wide receivers later. And the value made up with that second running back will, you'll be okay. It'll put you over the top. That was the first trend I stuck with. The second trend I stuck with, and I kind of do this every year, is to avoid players that change teams, specifically wide receivers that were going to be working with new quarterbacks in 2020. That is a trend that I like to stick with. It was something I doubled down on in 2020 because I was concerned about the lack of an offseason that the NFL had because of the pandemic. Coronavirus kept the NFL virtual throughout what is regularly off-season workouts, mini camps, training camp, preseason. Everything that leads up to the season was wiped out this off-season. So I was committed to finding situations where guys are in, at least at the top of the draft, they're in their third, their fourth. They have been in the same system for several years. They're playing with the same personnel. Maybe there was a coaching change here and there, but for the most part, the personnel is the same. I wanted continuity this year. I wanted stability this year. And in a lot of scenarios, that worked out. It absolutely made sense to draft Travis Kelce high, even though you see running backs and wide receivers go high, you tend to fade tight end. Travis Kelce was probably the safest pick on the board this year. You take away half his production, he was still a top 5 tight end. So that worked. Preaching continuity and stability made sense. But there were some scenarios where we were wrong. So that's what I want to focus on. Investing in running back early. Poof. This year was actually a phenomenal year for a zero running back strategy, that's always hard to get behind. There was only maybe 1 year where I truly, embraced the idea of zero RB. And then I was still taking a running back, at least one, with one of my first 2 picks. So I have a really hard time getting on board. If it's full PPR, okay. But that's about it. That's where I draw the line. And even then, running backs catch the ball more than ever these days too. So it's hard for me to get behind the idea of a zero RB strategy, but it worked this year. Look at what happened with the top running backs that got drafted. Christian McCaffrey played 3 games, missed most of the season. Saquon Barkley played 2 games, missed the entire season. He played like a game and a quarter, missed the entire season. Ezekiel Elliott, we saw the decline this year. He's not going to be a top 3 pick anymore. Not just next year, ever again. You could bookmark that. We saw the decline. Who else went high? Joe Mixon had 1 big game, missed the entire year. Clyde Edwards-Helaire vaulted his ADP, skyrocketed even in redraft leagues, just because he was attached to the Chiefs offense. And then after Damian Williams opted out, he became clearly the lead guy. He disappointed. Miles Sanders, low-end first-round pick, didn't work out a whole lot. He didn't get the volume that he probably should have, and he also missed time. So people liked James Conner in the 3rd round. Whew, that did not work out. So this was a good year for zero RB. If you waited to draft David Montgomery, if you waited to draft DeAndre Swift, if you waited to draft Antonio Gibson, James Robinson came out of nowhere. Myles Gaskin missed a lot of time, but was pretty effective when he played. This was just overall a really good year for zero RB. I'm not sure, though, that I would say that it was this was just a weird year. 2020 was a weird year. I think the reason not investing in running back backfired was because we saw, like I just mentioned, we saw so many injuries. So many players got hurt. And again, I think I can attribute some of that to the players missed so much practice time. We pretty much threw everyone into the fire week 1 right away. Again, no mini camps, no training camps, no preseason. All they had was, they weren't able to start practicing until just before the season started. So it was like full pads go. They never really, I don't think, had the time to get their body ready for the season, which is what a lot of players use training camp for. And obviously there's injuries then, but the injuries trickled into the season and a lot of big names were impacted by that. So I think it still makes sense to invest in running back early. I think that's a sound strategy every year. Taking 2 guys with your first 2 picks, taking 3 guys with your first 4 pick. I still think it makes sense. It turns out that this year, because of injuries, there was a lot of uncertainty. Again, on top of not having training camp not being good for the players, the fantasy community, the football-loving community, analysts, whatever have you, we didn't get the chance to see anything. There was no preseason games to go off of in terms of, okay, I can use the performance between these 2 players and leverage what I want to do based on what I saw. There was none of that this year. I still think investing in the names that like Christian McCaffrey is going to go right back to being the number 1 overall pick in a lot of drafts next year. He might get supplanted by Alvin Kamara and Dalvin Cook here and there, but McCaffrey, even though he missed the entire year, everybody knows what he can do. There's a reason he's going to go number 1 overall again, despite playing only 3 games. You want to invest in those name running backs that you can hang your hat on, because it's just, there's so much uncertainty once you drop out of the top 20 names, and even that might be generous. The top 15 names. After that, it's a lot of it's a crapshoot. So that's the running backs. I will probably say in 2021 to go back to the well and invest early in running back. It didn't work out this year, and I think a lot of that has to do with the lack of an off season. With the trend that I liked as far as sticking with stability, continuity, players that have been on the same team for several years. That meant that I was avoiding rookies. I was generally not drafting rookies. Clyde Edwards-Helaire was an exception. But again, that didn't work out. So there you go. It makes sense to fade rookies who have high expectations, especially when we didn't get the chance to see them. So I was avoiding rookies in the preseason. Didn't get a chance to see them in the preseason. And I was also avoiding players that switched teams. Again, I'm going to double down. I still think that is a sound strategy, but it's interesting. You have to look at, I think with this, you have to look at specific situations. And sometimes it's easy because hindsight is 20/20, but it's not one size fits all. So I'm going to just go ahead and talk specifically about two guys that I faded pretty much heavily. I don't think I had DeAndre Hopkins or Stefon Diggs in anywhere this year. I took DeAndre Hopkins in a startup dynasty league. That was about it. But I didn't like him this year because he was changing teams and changing quarterbacks. Same for Diggs. There was no offseason for them to be able, no true offseason that they were able to use to get acclimated with their new teams, their new offenses, and their new quarterback before the season. So I was worried about guys like that. And it had made sense in past years. Fading Odell Beckham in 2019 was a smart choice after he changed teams. He didn't have the Odell wide receiver one season that you expect. Very specific situation, but again, I think I was worried about the pandemic, and so I wanted to make sure I had guys who I already knew what their role was going to be on their team because it had already happened before. Here's why that didn't work this year, specifically with those two guys. Hopkins and Diggs were two guys that I was heavily fading. Now, obviously, they're both wide receiver ones. That was never going to be the question given their respective situations. I was just worried about the lack of being able to build any on-field chemistry with their quarterbacks. That was, I mean, I don't want to say it was dumb. It just because I stand by that, that analysis year over year or that trend year over year. But sometimes it makes sense to just take a step back and look at the specific situation. DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe this one was a little bit more obvious. And he was up at to be fair to our assessment, he was a little up and down this year. But he started the season out on absolute fire. And he didn't totally fade after the first 5-6 weeks. He came back to earth a little bit, but he was still putting up wide receiver one performances and was a wide receiver one on the season. It made sense to take him in the second round. I didn't like it. I was worried about it going into 2020, but I think with Hopkins, he had proven in his career when he was, all through his years in Houston, he played with a ton of quarterbacks then. Now, obviously, it's the same team, same system. He's not going anywhere. The coach is the same, so the environment is the same. But there was no stability at the quarterback position in Houston before Deshaun Watson. So Hopkins, maybe I should have taken that into account a little bit more. So again, you have to look at each specific situation. And obviously, Kyler Murray is, jury's out of, he's not better than Deshaun Watson as a quarterback right now, but he's certainly better than any of the other backup options that Hopkins had to play with, again, for most of his time in Houston. So that was a bit of a miss to not tell people, or to fade DeAndre Hopkins. With Stefon Diggs, I'm pleasantly surprised. I ended up actually having a lot of Josh Allen everywhere, so obviously that boosted Allen, but I didn't have any Diggs. This was a scenario where Diggs had not been the wide receiver one at any point in his career yet. He had put up big numbers. You knew he had all types of talent. You knew he wasn't a guy who he wouldn't totally fade being the number one option, but I'm not sure we can all sit here and say we expected Stefon Diggs to elevate his production as far as fantasy to top 5 wide receiver status. Changing teams. And on top of that, I just mentioned Josh Allen, who I love for fantasy, and that absolutely worked out this year because of his running. But you can't overlook the fact that going into this year, Josh Allen had always had pretty poor completion percentage his first 2 years in the league. Now, okay, he's still young. He's still ascending. And typically they say that third year for quarterbacks is when they take that next step. Well, guess what? Allen took it. He's now he's completing 70% of his passes. He wasn't over 60% his first 2 years in the league. So he had a tremendous jump. Can we all sit here and act like we should have seen that coming? No, I don't think so. But again, there's another trend. This is a specific trend. A third-year quarterback taking a leap, and Allen did that with a great offense, an outstanding offensive play caller, and an offense that wants to throw the ball. Stephon Diggs, they had John Brown and Cole Beasley already, and they had an ascending option at tight end in Dawson Knox. Now, it turns out Buffalo could barely run the ball this year, but Allen keeps plays alive with his legs. So maybe we should have seen that. Again, it's easy to say because of hindsight, but you just, I guess, sometimes need to look at the specific situation before just assuming that that situation is going to end up being a part of a trend that you like to stick with, or believe that, year over year it makes sense to avoid these types of players. Well, sometimes the situation needs a little bit more, digging into. And so maybe don't necessarily be afraid of players switching teams if the specific situation shows that there's a young quarterback who has upside. We're talking about Josh Allen. He's going into 2020. Obviously, he had not proven he's an elite or top tier talent yet, but you knew he was going to get every opportunity. It's not like the Bills were going to move off of Josh Allen this year for any reason. And Allen took that next step. He took that third-year leap. So, maybe look for if a quarterback gets a new receiver going into his third year. Obviously, this is, again, very specific situation, but that could be reason to pounce instead of fading. So you got to just keep an open mind. Don't stick to your guns year over year just because. It's tedious. There's a lot to do. And that's what we're here for, to help you with that. But it makes sense to look at every nitty-gritty situation and not just paint everything with a broad brush. Lessons learned for 2020. While I do think it still makes sense to invest early in running back and to avoid players on new teams, at the end of the day, look at each specific situation. What I think makes even more sense, find players on good teams with good quarterbacks, or young quarterbacks that obviously they are poised to make a jump. They're poised to take their production to another level. That happens with a lot of third-year quarterbacks. Don't necessarily see a guy that gets traded this year. I'm kind of telling myself this too as I say this. Don't just see a guy get traded this year and assume that because he's in a new situation that it's going to be a not ideal situation for fantasy. Because if 2020 proved anything, it's that to expect the unexpected and always be ready to roll with the punches. So obviously a bread and butter strategy works of if a tried and true formula has gotten you where it is, you're consistently doing well in your leagues, and you're making the playoffs every year, or you're at least fielding a competitive team year in, year out. Do what works for you, but what can put you over the edge, what can truly set you out every year, is roll with the punches. If something changes, analyze the situation. Break that specific situation down as it unfolds. Don't just label it as, it's going to be like every other situation, because it's not. And that is how you stay ahead of the curve in fantasy football, by being able to take a step back and see where you can improve. That's all I got. That's what we intend to do, is make fantasy players better. So I hope this was helpful. I absolutely like taking a look at what I got wrong. I like looking at what I got wrong at the end of each year to see where I can improve. And I'm hopeful that we got the chance to do that today. So stick with your strategies that have gotten you this far, but don't be afraid to pivot when a different opportunity presents itself.